for that message, Elena. I always appreciate a little bit of math in the morning. But big numbers, that's nice. The disciples may not have always paid extremely close attention to Jesus, but perhaps they could be forgiven this morning for not understanding, because Jesus tells them something they hadn't totally heard before, something new. And I've been thinking of it this week as Mark's big plot twist. If you've ever read books or watched shows, you're familiar with what a plot twist is. And so this is the point of the story where Mark introduces his plot twist. Everything so far in the first 8 chapters of this gospel, they've been building up. We've been looking up. But this is the point where it's all about to go downhill in a hurry. Jesus has been healing people. He's been casting out demons. He's been performing miracles like walking on water and multiplying just a few loaves of bread to feed thousands of people. And everybody's been coming out of the towns and the villages and following him all over the countryside just to get a glimpse of him. And the disciples are on top of the world because they're in the company of such a highly acclaimed person. Everything looks great. And then Jesus goes and pulls the rug out from under them. And he starts with a simple question. Who do people say I am? The answer comes easily enough. Some say John the Baptist, because, by the way, John the Baptist had been beheaded by this point. That was a few chapters earlier. So some people say that Jesus is John the Baptist, come back to life in some way. Others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets. But then Jesus rephrases the question and says, who do you say I am? All of you, my followers, who have been with me for quite a long time now, who have heard my teaching and seen my works, who know me well. Have you been paying attention to what I've been saying? Who do you say I am? And Peter, as usual, shouts out with the answer before anyone else has a chance to even think about it. Peter jumps up and says, you're the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. You're the anointed one who is going to inherit the throne of his ancestor David. You're the one who's going to march into Jerusalem in triumph and glory and get rid of all those Roman authorities and sit on your throne with the crown on your head and reign over all of Israel. You're the one the scriptures have been talking about. You're the one we've been waiting for. It's going to be great. That's who we say you are. Aren't we right, Jesus? Isn't that right? And then comes the twist. Jesus says, yes, I am the Messiah. But that's not what you think it means. I'm not the kind of Messiah you were expecting. Verse 31 says, Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and then he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. The disciples were expecting a Messiah who would have a crown of glory on his head. They were expecting a Messiah who would be lifted up high above all of his people. But the only crown that this Messiah would wear would be a crown of thorns. The only time he would be lifted up high would be on the cross. Not in triumph and glory, but in dejection and humiliation. This is the plot twist. The ever-popular teacher, preacher, healer, miracle worker, truth teller, comforter, friend of the outcast, Jesus from Nazareth. This man who was determined to unsettle the established social order, who welcomed in the oppressed and sinners, and even dared to eat at the same table with them. This man who told the religious elites that all of their laws put together were not as important as caring for people and striving for justice and showing love to one another. This man, our Savior, refused to call off his mission and finally made enough people mad at him that he got himself killed. And it's such an ironic plot twist, because Jesus was not killed by atheists or immigrants or foreigners or people who practiced some other religion. No, Jesus was put to death by his very own people, his own flesh and blood. The religious crowd, very good and upstanding people who were in the synagogue every Sabbath, who thought they were obeying God's commands. And if that description worries you, well, it worries me too. Because sometimes I think that we're tempted to think that we are good and upstanding people, religious people, in church every Sunday, who think that we usually are obeying God's commands. The religious leaders thought that they knew who the Messiah was and what he would look like and what he would not look like. And Jesus just didn't match their description. And so maybe it's good for us every now and then to ask ourselves, who do we say that the Messiah is? What do we think the Messiah looks like? Do we tend to picture a Messiah who reigns in glory? Or do we picture a Messiah who is despised and rejected? A man with many sorrows and acquainted with grief. And the all-important follow-up question, which Jesus didn't ask, but which was hanging in the air, was this. Now that you, my disciples, know who I really am, now that you know what kind of Messiah I am, and what that means, do you still want to be my disciples? Are you willing to keep following me? Are you willing to take up your cross and follow in my footsteps? Of course, we know the rest of the story. Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus. The other 11 disciples fled and abandoned Jesus when he was arrested. But later, they did follow Jesus. They followed in his footsteps. They continued his mission. They shared the good news. And yes, some of them, maybe all of them, depending on which traditions you read, were killed for what they did, just like Jesus. In various ways. Some were stabbed with the sword, some were also put on a cross. But they took up their cross and followed. And so I think it's time to ask all of us the same question. We know what kind of Messiah we have. That's clear. Jesus is not someone who ever lets us feel comfortable, or lets us stand still, or tells us so we can sit back and relax. No, I think Jesus calls to us with a radical voice, pushing us out of our comfort zones, and telling us to work on behalf of the afflicted and the marginalized, and to keep doing that work until wholeness and restoration and justice for all people is achieved. But by doing that, the risk is we might lose our lives. It's a very serious matter. And so, knowing all of this, do all of us still want to be Jesus' disciples? Are we willing to take up our cross and follow after Jesus? What does that look like, to take up our cross? Sometimes people use that phrase very casually, don't they? They say things like, oh, I'm just so addicted to chocolate, but that's just my cross I have to bear. Or, gosh, I already have so many wrinkles on my face, but you know what? That's just my own cross I have to bear. But taking up your cross has nothing to do with any of that. Here's what it looks like. It looks like someone who pays regular visits to the nursing home to visit people. Or maybe it looks like someone who gives their time to an after-school program for at-risk teenagers. Maybe taking up your cross looks like someone who volunteers at a crisis pregnancy center. It can be all of these things. A good example of taking up your cross and following Jesus would be working tirelessly on behalf of the disadvantaged and the underrepresented, and making sure they're treated fairly in the criminal justice system. This is how Brian Stevenson, lawyer and author of the book Just Mercy, has spent his entire career. After graduation, he moved to Atlanta and began working for the Southern Center for Human Rights. Later, he founded the Equal Justice Initiative, where he works to defend people who can't afford representation, or people who have been wrongfully convicted, or people who have received overly harsh prison sentences. In his book, Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson says, the true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And so that leads us to ask ourselves that question. Who are the poor and the disfavored and the accused, the incarcerated and the condemned that we see around us? We don't have to go to a prison to see those people. Maybe we see those people at school, or at our workplace, or just in the community. How do we treat those people who are being oppressed? How would Jesus encourage us to treat them? It's in standing up for people like this, for the least of these, that we truly begin to take up our cross and follow after Jesus. And by doing so, we can gain our lives, because we have this promise from Jesus. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for my sake, and for the sake of the gospel, that person will save it. Amen.